The last thing my mother said to me before I left was, "You'll never survive without me. You're nothing on your own." I believed her. For 26 years, I believed every word she said about me, that I was weak, ungrateful, difficult, and ultimately worthless. It took losing everything to realize the truth. This is my comeback story, but at the time, it felt like the end of my life. I grew up in a quiet suburb where everything looked perfect from the outside. White fences, clean lawns, smiling holiday photos. People used to tell me how lucky I was to have such a devoted mother. They didn't see what happened after the front door closed. My mom had a way of speaking that sounded loving to everyone else. Soft voice, gentle smile, concerned tone. But when we were alone, her words changed. "You're too sensitive. No one will ever love you like I do. You're not smart enough to make it on your own." At first, I thought this was normal parenting. Discipline, tough love, motivation. It wasn't until years later that I learned the phrase emotional abuse, and once I understood it, I couldn't unsee it. Growing up with a toxic parent is confusing in a way that's hard to explain. There are no bruises, no broken bones, just a slow erosion of who you are. By the time I was a teenager, I second-guessed everything. Every decision, every friendship, every dream. If I got an A, she'd ask why it wasn't higher. If I made a friend, she'd point out their flaws. If I talked about college, she'd laugh softly and say, "Let's be realistic." That laugh stayed with me longer than any insult. My father left when I was 9. Not dramatically, just quietly packed a suitcase and never came back. After that, my mother made sure I understood something very clearly. We only have each other. At first, it sounded comforting. Later, it felt like a cage. She controlled everything. My finances, my schedule, even my passwords when I got older. When I finally got a part-time job at 19, she insisted my paycheck go into a shared family account. "For your own good," she said. "You're terrible with money." I didn't question it. Children raised under emotional abuse rarely do. By 25, I was still living at home, still asking permission, still feeling like a failure. Every time I mentioned moving out, she'd sigh heavily and remind me how expensive the world was, how dangerous, how cruel. "You wouldn't last a month," she'd say gently. "People like you always come crawling back." I didn't realize then how carefully she was shaping my fear, how a toxic parent can make dependence feel like love. Looking back now, I see the pattern clearly. But at the time, I thought she was protecting me. I thought she was the only person who would ever care enough to tell me the truth. I had no idea that the same woman who called me worthless would one day be the reason I finally discovered my worth. And when that day came, everything changed, for both of us. But not in the way she expected. For a long time, I thought love was supposed to feel like pressure. Like walking on glass and calling it loyalty, like shrinking yourself so someone else could feel taller. That's what growing up with a toxic parent teaches you. My mother didn't scream or throw things. She didn't need to. Her weapon was disappointment, a raised eyebrow, a long silence, a quiet, "I expected more from you." That was enough to keep me in line. Every major decision in my life somehow passed through her first. What I studied, where I worked, who I talked to. She'd ask questions that sounded supportive but weren't. "Are you sure you can handle that? Don't you think you're aiming a little high? I just don't want to see you fail." And I believed her, because when you grow up under emotional abuse, doubt becomes your native language. I worked as an administrative assistant at a small firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, but it was mine. Or at least, I thought it was. Every morning she asked what time I'd be home. Every night she wanted to know who I spoke to. If I stayed late, she accused me of lying. When I started dating someone, nothing serious, just coffee and conversation, she found out within a week. How did you meet him? What does he want from you? Do you really think someone like that is interested in you? She never told me not to see him. She didn't need to. By the third date, I canceled on my own. That's how emotional abuse works. You start doing the damage for them. Sometimes she'd remind me how much she had sacrificed, her career, her youth, her happiness. All for you, she'd say, sighing dramatically, and guilt would settle into my chest like a stone. I told myself this was normal, that all mothers were like this behind closed doors. But there were cracks in that belief. At work, my manager once praised a report I stayed late to finish. I remember smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. When I told my mother, she barely looked up from her phone. "Don't let it go to your head," she said. "People praise you before they replace you." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering why her words always felt heavier than everyone else's. I didn't know it then, but something inside me had started to shift. A quiet, dangerous thought. What if she's wrong? That thought scared me more than anything she'd ever said, because questioning her meant questioning everything I believed about myself. Still, the seed was planted, and seeds don't need permission to grow. What I didn't realize was that this tiny spark of self-awareness would eventually become a comeback story, one shaped by pain, silence, and something far more powerful than revenge. I didn't plan to leave. I didn't plan to disappear. But the more she tightened her grip, the more I felt something else pulling me forward. Not anger, not hatred, just the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe. The first time I noticed something truly off, it was over something small. So small, I almost ignored it. I came home from work and saw my laptop open on the kitchen table. That wasn't unusual. Mara borrowed it sometimes to job hunt. But this time, my email inbox was open. Not just open, read. At first, I told myself it was an accident. Maybe she'd needed to print something. Maybe she'd clicked the wrong tab. Still, a strange chill settled in my chest. That laptop held everything: work files, personal conversations, financial documents. My entire life lived inside it, and suddenly it felt exposed. When Mara walked in, I asked casually, "Hey, did you use my laptop today?" She paused for half a second, then smiled. "Yeah, just to check some job postings. Hope that's okay." "Of course," I said quickly. "Just next time, can you log out of my email if it pops up?" Her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, a flash of offense, then a laugh. "Wow, you think I'm snooping?" "No, I didn't say that." "You kind of did." The room grew heavy. I felt myself backtracking immediately. "I just meant for privacy, work stuff, you know?" She shook her head and walked away, muttering something about trust. Within minutes, I was the one apologizing. That became the pattern. Every time I felt uncomfortable, I ended up comforting her. That's how emotional confusion works in toxic family drama. You start doubting your own instincts. Over the next few weeks, small irregularities kept appearing. My favorite sweater showed up in her laundry pile without her asking to borrow it. My expensive skincare products started running out faster. Once, I noticed money missing from the envelope where I kept emergency cash. Nothing was big enough to confront directly, but together they created a constant, low-level anxiety. I began second-guessing myself. Maybe I'd misplaced things. Maybe I was being paranoid. Mara, meanwhile, acted as affectionate as ever, cooking dinner, calling me the best sister in the world, posting photos of us online with captions about gratitude and love. To everyone else, we looked inseparable. Inside the apartment, I felt like I was slowly losing control of my own space. This is the part of my no-contact story that people find hardest to understand, because there was no dramatic fight yet, no obvious villain, just a growing sense that something was deeply wrong. One evening, I got home earlier than usual. Mara didn't hear me come in. Her voice drifted from the living room, low, sharp, unfamiliar. She was on the phone. "I'm telling you, she has no idea," she said. A pause, then a soft laugh. She trusts me completely. My heart stopped. I stood frozen in the hallway, keys still in my hand. Every instinct told me to step forward and reveal myself, to ask who she was talking to demand an explanation, but I didn't move. A strange, heavy feeling settled over me. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet, creeping dread. For the first time, I wondered if my life, my home, my relationship with her wasn't what I thought it was at all. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed her words over and over. She has no idea. She trusts me completely. The next morning, she acted normal, smiling, making coffee, asking about my day. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything, but something inside me had shifted, a thin crack running through the center of my trust. I didn't know it yet, but that crack would eventually break everything open, and when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just hurt, it would change the way I understood loyalty, healing, and what real revenge after betrayal actually looks like. After that phone call, I started noticing everything, not in a dramatic, confrontational way, just quietly, carefully. For the first time, I stopped assuming Mara's intentions were good, and once that assumption disappeared, the patterns became impossible to ignore. My no-contact story didn't begin with anger, it began with observation. I started locking my laptop when I left the room, keeping my wallet in my work bag instead of on the counter, saving important documents to a cloud drive she couldn't access. Small precautions. On the surface, nothing changed between us, but internally, something was shifting. For the first time in years, I began prioritizing my own sense of safety. Mara noticed immediately. "You've been distant," she said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter. Her tone was light, but her eyes were searching, suspicious. "Just busy with work," I replied. She nodded slowly, then smiled in a way that felt rehearsed. "You know you can tell me anything, right? We don't keep secrets." The irony almost made me laugh, but instead I just nodded. Over the next few weeks, her behavior intensified in subtle ways. More questions about my schedule, more curiosity about my finances, more comments about how lucky I was to have stability. "You've always had it easier than me," she said one night while we folded laundry. Not accusatory, just observational. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure how to, because part of me knew that wasn't entirely true. I had worked for everything I had, carefully, consistently. But Mara had a way of rewriting reality, especially in our family drama. She positioned herself as the struggling one, and me as the fortunate one who owed her understanding. Still, I stayed quiet, watched, waited. Then came the message that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work, halfway through a meeting, when a notification flashed across my phone. "Bank alert. Unusual transaction detected." My stomach dropped. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, hands suddenly cold. When I opened my banking app, my vision blurred for a second. A large transfer had been made from my savings account. Not a few dollars, not a small mistake. Thousands. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. I checked again, hoping it was a glitch, a system error, anything else. But the details were clear. The transfer had been authorized using my logged-in account from home, from my laptop. A strange calm settled over me. Not panic, not even immediate anger, just clarity. I knew exactly who had done it. The rest of the workday passed in a haze. I moved through tasks automatically. My mind replayed every small moment from the past year, every borrowed item, every subtle guilt trip, every time she'd positioned herself as the victim. By the time I got home that evening, the apartment lights were warm and welcoming. Dinner was cooking. Mara stood at the stove, humming softly. She turned when she saw me and smiled like nothing in the world was wrong. "Hey, you're home early." I studied her face, the ease, the confidence, the complete lack of concern. In that moment, something inside me didn't just crack, it broke clean in two. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was betrayal, real, undeniable betrayal.
And standing there in my own kitchen, I realized something else too. The healing I needed wasn't going to come from another conversation, or another chance, or another attempt to understand her. It was going to come from distance, from truth, from finally seeing things as they were, and although I didn't know exactly how yet, the path toward revenge after betrayal had already begun, quietly, logically, and without her noticing at all.
I didn't confront her that night. That's the part people always expect. The explosion, the shouting, the dramatic accusation across the dinner table. But my no-contact story didn't unfold like that. Instead, I sat down and ate the dinner she'd made. I asked about her day. I even smiled. Because the moment I saw that bank transfer, something inside me went very still. And in that stillness, I realized something important. If I reacted emotionally, she would turn this into another chapter of our endless family drama. She would cry, deflect, blame stress, blame trauma, blame me, and somehow I would end up apologizing again. So I stayed calm. After dinner, I told her I was exhausted and went to my room. Once the door closed, my hands started shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor. I opened my laptop and reviewed everything carefully: login history, transfer confirmation, device access. There it was, clear as daylight. My banking session had been accessed from home that afternoon, at a time I'd been in the office. There was no doubt, but instead of crying, I started documenting. Screenshots, transaction records, email confirmations, every detail saved into a private folder she couldn't access. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was thinking strategically. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about identity, about realizing that the person I'd protected my whole life had been quietly exploiting me. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I finally saw the pattern for what it was. Every guilt trip, every emotional crisis timed perfectly when I needed space. Every subtle way she made me feel responsible for her survival. It wasn't love, it was control. Admitting that hurt more than the stolen money. The next morning, she greeted me with her usual warmth, coffee ready, music playing softly, as if nothing had happened. I studied her face while she talked about a show she'd watched the night before. How easily she moved through the world, how comfortably she lied. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. Closure wasn't going to come from a confession, or an apology, or even justice in the traditional sense. My healing would come from stepping out of the cycle entirely. But before I could leave, I needed certainty, a full picture of what she'd done and how long it had been happening. Over the next few days, I quietly checked everything: old bank statements, shared subscriptions, mail. The truth was worse than I expected. Small transfers I'd overlooked, subscriptions opened in my name, a credit card application started but never completed. It hadn't been a one-time decision. It had been a slow, deliberate pattern. Strangely, the deeper I looked, the calmer I became. This wasn't rage building, it was clarity settling in. For the first time, I wasn't thinking like the younger sister trapped in endless family drama. I was thinking like someone preparing to walk away, completely. And somewhere in that quiet planning, a new understanding began to form. Real revenge after betrayal doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like silence, like distance, like removing access to everything someone once took for granted. By the end of that week, I had a plan. She still had no idea. Once I had the full picture, something inside me shifted permanently. The confusion was gone. The guilt was gone. Even most of the anger had settled into something quieter, something sharper. Clarity.
This was the turning point in my no-contact story, not when I discovered the betrayal, but when I stopped hoping she would change. From that moment on, every decision I made was intentional, calm, careful, focused on healing, not confrontation. And she didn't notice a thing. I didn't accuse her of taking the money. I didn't bring up the transactions. I didn't even hint that I knew. Instead, I became normal, pleasant, predictable. I cooked dinner twice that week, asked about her job search, watched a movie with her on Friday night like we always did. On the surface, our life looked exactly the same. Underneath, everything was changing. The first step was financial separation. I opened a new bank account at a different institution during my lunch break, transferred my salary deposits, moved my savings into a secure account she had no way of accessing. Then I quietly updated all my passwords: email, cloud storage, utilities, work platforms. Every digital doorway she'd ever walked through was closed, one by one. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I moved slowly enough that nothing felt suspicious. This wasn't dramatic revenge after betrayal. It was structural. A careful dismantling of every way she could reach into my life. At home, I started reducing what I shared. No more detailed conversations about work bonuses or upcoming projects. No more casual mentions of my schedule or financial plans. If she asked questions, I answered vaguely, kindly, without giving anything real away. At first, she didn't react. Then, subtly, she started probing. "You've been quiet lately," she said one evening. "Just tired," I replied. "You know you can talk to me about anything." "I know." I kept my tone warm, soft, unthreatening. Inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. This is the phase people rarely talk about in family drama stories: the quiet withdrawal, the emotional detachment that happens before the physical exit. It's not explosive, it's not cinematic, but it's powerful. Over the next 2 weeks, I secured everything I needed for independence: a new apartment lease signed quietly online, a moving company booked for a weekday morning when she'd be out, important documents transferred to a safety deposit box. Each step felt surreal, like I was preparing to leave a life I'd built piece by piece. And yet, with every task completed, I felt lighter. This was healing in motion, not through confrontation or forgiveness, but through self-protection. One night, Mara sat beside me on the couch and rested her shoulder on mine. "Don't ever leave me," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." For a moment, old instincts flared, the urge to comfort, to reassure, to stay. But instead, I just smiled gently and said nothing. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. She didn't love me. She relied on me. And there's a difference. By the end of that month, everything was ready. Every account secured, every belonging sorted, every emotional tie quietly loosened. She still thought we were inseparable, still believed I was the dependable sister who would always stay. She had no idea that my silence wasn't submission anymore. It was preparation. The final step of my no-contact story was approaching, and when it happened, it wouldn't involve shouting or dramatic confrontation, just absence, and the kind of revenge after betrayal that comes from removing yourself completely, leaving the other person alone with the consequences they never thought they'd face.
I left felt strangely peaceful. No dramatic music, no confrontation waiting to happen, just a quiet Tuesday with pale sunlight coming through the curtains. Mara had an early interview across town. She rushed out the door in a blur of perfume and nervous energy, calling over her shoulder, "Wish me luck." I smiled and told her she'd do great. Then the door closed behind her. And just like that, the final chapter of my no-contact story began. The moving company arrived 30 minutes later, efficient, professional, silent. I'd already packed most of my belongings into discreet boxes over the past week, labeling them as office files or donations, so nothing looked unusual. Within 2 hours, everything that truly belonged to me was gone. Clothes, documents, electronics, even the small framed photos from my bedroom wall. I left behind only what was technically hers: furniture she'd brought, shared kitchen items, and a short envelope placed neatly on the kitchen counter. Inside was a simple note: I know about the money. I know about everything. This isn't anger, it's distance. Please don't contact me again. No accusations, no insults, no dramatic explanations. Just truth. By the time she returned that afternoon, I was already in my new apartment across the city, sitting on the floor, surrounded by unopened boxes and a silence that felt clean. For the first time in years, my nervous system wasn't bracing for the next emotional crisis. There were no heavy footsteps in the hallway, no sudden guilt-laced conversations, no subtle tension humming in the air, just stillness. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, my phone lit up. Mara calling. I watched it ring without moving, then stop, then ring again. Voicemails started filling my inbox. Texts followed. Where are you? This isn't funny. Did something happen? Please answer me. The messages shifted quickly. Confusion turned to panic. Panic turned to anger. Anger turned to something I'd never seen from her before: desperation. By evening, the texts grew longer, messier, less controlled. You can't just disappear. We're family. I said I'd pay you back. You're overreacting. Then finally, I need you. I read every message once, calmly, without responding. Then I blocked her number. Not out of cruelty, not out of spite, but because this was the only way my healing could truly begin. This is the part people misunderstand about revenge after betrayal. They imagine dramatic showdowns, public exposure, harsh words. But the most powerful shift happens in silence. Over the next few weeks, mutual relatives reached out. At first gently, then with thinly veiled pressure. Mara's really struggling, one aunt told me over the phone. She says you abandoned her. I listened politely, then said only, I wish her well, but I'm focusing on my health right now. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I didn't re-enter the family drama. Without my participation, the story lost momentum. There was no conflict to feed on, no emotional reactions to analyze, just distance. A month later, I heard through a cousin that Mara had moved out of the apartment. She couldn't afford it alone. Her job interview hadn't worked out. Several friends she'd relied on were suddenly too busy to help. For the first time in her life, she was facing consequences without a safety net. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. Just steady. Because karma hadn't arrived through anything I'd done to her. It arrived through what I'd stopped doing for her. And in the quiet space that followed, I realized something unexpected. Walking away wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a life where my energy finally belonged to me. The first few weeks after I cut her off felt unreal. Not lonely, not empty, just quiet. I hadn't realized how loud my life had become until the noise disappeared. The constant emotional tension, the subtle anxiety, the feeling that at any moment something would go wrong and I'd have to fix it. When people hear my no-contact story, they often imagine dramatic freedom, a sudden rush of happiness, a cinematic sense of victory. The truth is softer than that. Freedom for me arrived in small, ordinary moments. Making coffee in the morning without checking my phone for crisis messages. Going out with friends without guilt sitting heavy in my chest.
buying something for myself without calculating how it might affect someone else. It felt unfamiliar at first, then slowly it started to feel normal. That's when the real healing began. I started therapy a month after moving, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I'd stayed in that cycle for so long, why I'd confused responsibility with love, why I'd tolerated years of subtle manipulation, why I'd ignored my own discomfort to keep the peace in our family drama. My therapist said something in our second session that stayed with me. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they're safe. It sounds obvious now, but back then it felt revolutionary. For most of my life, I believed endurance was proof of love, that loyalty meant staying no matter what, that protecting family mattered more than protecting myself. Walking away challenged everything I thought I knew about loyalty, but it also gave me something I'd never had before: peace. Occasionally, I still hear updates about Mara through distant relatives. She moved cities again, started a new job, lost it, started over. There was a time when those updates would have pulled me back into the emotional gravity of our relationship, made me feel responsible, made me question my decision. Now, they don't. Not because I'm cold, not because I don't care, but because I finally understand where my responsibility ends. This is what real revenge after betrayal looks like sometimes. Not destruction, not humiliation, just distance and growth. Living well without the person who once drained you, building a life they no longer have access to, refusing to participate in cycles that once defined you. My no-contact story didn't turn me into someone bitter. If anything, it made me softer, but in a stronger way. I'm more careful about who I give my energy to, more honest about my boundaries, more aware that healing isn't selfish, it's necessary. The old family drama still exists somewhere, I'm sure, but it no longer includes me. And that's the quiet kind of peace I used to think was impossible. Sometimes I wonder if she regrets what happened, if she understands why I left, if she ever realizes that losing me wasn't sudden, it was the result of years of small choices. But those questions don't control me anymore, because the most important part of this no-contact story isn't what she lost, it's what I finally gained: clarity, stability, and a life that feels like my own. Real healing doesn't always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from release, from choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. And if you've ever lived through a betrayal that forced you to walk away, if you've ever stepped out of a cycle that kept hurting you, what would you have done in my place?